What's that? Go, I'm going. We're good. All right. So, last week I promised that this week you would hear the world's greatest sermon tribute. So what I'm going to speak about is considered the world's greatest sermon. It's the one Jesus gave, and it's found in Matthew 5 to 7. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. Most people know it as that. And it has some of the greatest wisdom in the world. And if you look at all of the other sort of religions thing, the great wisdoms they have, it's all wrapped up in there and more, which is amazing. It really is quite an incredible sermon as such. But today, I want to start, because I've had to do a whole essay on this, so you have to listen to it, on background. Let's start with background. Hopefully at the end of it we'll have some stuff that comes from it and it'll be good for you. But I do want to start with a bit of background that will hopefully give you some insight into this great sermon, into what it's about, and why Matthew penned this stuff of Jesus. Because most of the stuff in there, Matthew's the only one that says, and some of it Luke says, and Mark doesn't say virtually any of it, and John doesn't say any of it at all. So it's interesting that this is an important thing to Matthew's gospel. So, first of all, we're going to have a look at this. Is what you have to do when you're doing an essay. You have to start with who's the writer. So, who was the writer of this gospel? Who do you think it was? Matthew, says John over here. And if you said that directly in an essay, they'd mark you wrong. They'd say, because that's what happens when you do this sort of thing. And you're not doing an essay, so you get to just listen to my ramblings about it. But the truth is, the early church says it was Matthew, the tax collector. So Matthew, the tax collector, is one of Jesus' 12 disciples. We call him the tax collector because when Jesus said, "Come follow me," he was a tax collector. He was collecting taxes. And he left that behind and followed Jesus. So that's why he's called that. And so the early church say this from really early. We know that they said that this was Matthew's gospel. He'd said this. That doesn't mean that people say that he did these days. You find that. There's a lot of this. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is because behind it there's something important. So, because there are some arguments against Matthew doing it. And the main one is this, that he uses Mark's gospel, often word for word. And he does. Because Mark's gospel is much shorter and has all the action in it. All the action of Jesus, only a little bit of Jesus' words. And it's all action. If you're sort of you love your action movies, read Mark. To borrow something, you're hitting on something, Chris. You are hitting on for a tax collector. Is that right, John? To borrow from other people, to take from other people? Yes. So, they say that. And when you read Matthew's gospel and you read it alongside Mark's, there are bits that are exactly the same, word for word. Luke is the same, actually. In fact, both Luke and Matthew steal a whole lot of Mark's gospel. Nearly the whole of it is in there in some way, shape, or form. But what Matthew does, sometimes Matthew makes it shorter because he just wants to say this was happening and Mark's already talked about this, and then goes on. Or sometimes he expands on things. And then there's a whole lot of other stuff that's just Matthew's stuff. Right? So they say this, and then the real question is, why would an eyewitness, Matthew's meant to be an eyewitness, why would he use someone else's account? Doesn't make sense, does it? On what Mark said, there is some of that, definitely. We look at it and you go, it's something you have to wrestle with when you're doing these things. You don't have to wrestle with it now. The only reason why I'm bringing it up because I think there's something in it for us. Mark was likely first. In fact, what they think, and most people think this, is that Mark was actually very early, sort of in the 50s to 60s AD, maybe to 70 at most, sort of in that range. But Matthew's was quite a bit later, and Luke's was a bit later. And John's was even later. That's what they think when they do study. And there's reasons to think that. I'm not going to bore you with it because it's very boring. But there are reasons to think this. But it is worth looking at, saying, well, if Matthew did it, he was there, wasn't he? He was watching. Why would he use Mark's one? It's odd, isn't it? That's the real question, isn't it? And that's what I argued. That it's an acceptable ancient practice, actually. It's done all the time in the ancient world. It's even done in Scripture beforehand in the Old Testament. Does anyone know where that happens? Chronicles, that's right. The books of Chronicles, 1 and 2 Chronicles, basically copy nearly every word from Samuel except when they want to talk about the things they want to talk about, which is about the temple and all the people that they list and all of that stuff, which is a little bit tedious to me. But it's a really common thing to do. And so if Mark's came first, and Matthew knows it, in fact what it seems is that the whole church knew Mark's gospel quite early. It went around a lot. And Matthew knows this and goes, well, that's good. That's what I can hang what I want to say on. See, that's the important thing. He wants to say something specific to a specific group about things that Mark didn't say, but Mark's gospel is true, and so he wants to use it. That is the most likely sort of thing happening here. But it makes sense, doesn't it? He feels that well, for a reason too. There's a specific reason. See, if you look at Chronicles with the book of Samuel, the reason Chronicles is different in the bits it's different is because it only cares about the area of Judah and only cares about the temple. But if it gets those bits of Samuel, it's word for word. So it's interesting how that happens. And Matthew does a little bit similar in this. So what's really important is the differences. We don't see that. When you read it through, you don't see that, do you? But actually, the readers of Matthew would have read Mark, and when Mark was commonly around, well, actually, can I say they wouldn't have read Mark? They would have listened to Mark, because very few of them could read. You have to remember this when you do these things. Very few could read, and it was read out in their services and things. So that's how they would know. But they would know the stories from Mark and go, oh, Matthew's doing something different here. So it's important, isn't it? All right, so we better look at some of these things. What are the differences? What are some of the differences? So Matthew is by far the most Jewish of the Gospels. What do I mean by that? Well, a couple of things that tell that is, there's many, but I'm only giving you a couple because it's boring if I give you everything. He has quotes fulfilled of Old Testament verses all the time. Constantly. This is to fulfill what this prophet said. This is to fulfill what that prophet said. All the way through Matthew's gospel, it's saying, oh, this fulfills this fulfills that, this fulfills that. Makes sense, doesn't it? And so likely, there's something to do with the fact that the Old Testament's really important and the fulfilling of these scriptures. This is interesting. He doesn't bother explaining Jewish customs. He just doesn't bother. Mark and Luke both explain customs. We'll say this about it. Why? Because people don't know them, do they? But Matthew doesn't bother. It's not important. No, it's not needed. Probably more than not important. It's not needed. So, the other difference, he has 5 long discourses of Jesus. 5 really long bits, like Matthew 5 to 7 is all Jesus speaking. There's a big chunk in Matthew 10, big chunk in 17, 18 I think, and big chunk in 23, 24 and 25. The others don't have Jesus speaking nearly that much. And particularly, it's about teaching. It's constantly teaching. So Matthew very much has Jesus as the great teacher. Jesus is the great teacher, just as Moses was the great teacher. There's a verse in the Old Testament that's really interesting that Moses says in Deuteronomy 19. And he says it about the coming Messiah. Does anyone know what he says? Quite interesting because of the way Matthew thinks. He says to the people, one from among your very own will arise like me. Listen to him. That's what Moses says. It says, one from among you will rise up like me. Listen to him. So here we have, Moses was the bringer of the law, the great teacher. Well, here we have the new great teacher. Listen to him. That's important, isn't it? So we have Matthew sort of bringing up these things that the others didn't really do as much. He also has this is really weird in Matthew. He has Jesus fulfilling the role of Israel, doing what Israel should have done, doing what Israel did. Probably the most famous verse for this is this little one. Out of Egypt I have called my son. That's when, and it's only Matthew that does this, so I'm giving you this information so you can know it and understand, but there's stuff behind it as well. When Jesus is a baby and Herod comes and kills all the babies where Jesus was staying in Bethlehem, and they flee to Egypt, and then from Egypt God says, come back. And Matthew says that's to fulfill what was said, out of Egypt I called my son. But actually, my son in that is the children of Israel in the original verse. So very much he has Jesus fulfilling what Israel should be. So these are important ideas in Matthew. You can see he's very Jewish, isn't he? So who would this suggest he's writing to? To Jews. That's exactly right. He's writing to Jews, isn't he? And that's what we've been able to surmise. It wasn't that hard to surmise this from Matthew's stuff because he's pretty blunt. He's writing to Jewish people, likely Jewish Christians. And any other Jew that will listen, of course, but a group of Jewish Christians. So it's worth looking at the audience. Now I know I'm doing a bit of history here, and I love this stuff, but some of you may not. But trust me, there's good at the end of it, hopefully. So the audience. We've said there are a bunch of Jews, likely Jewish Christians. But it's important to know what was going on at the time, what was happening. So really important events happened in that little bit of land I've got there on the map at that time. Just before, likely before Matthew writes this, in AD 70, Jerusalem is destroyed. That's a monumental event, isn't it, in the life of Jews? So Jerusalem is destroyed, and what's destroyed along with Jerusalem that's important? The temple. That's right. So the place that they were meant to go and worship has been smashed to the ground. How are the Jews feeling at the moment? Dashed. They're alienated from God. Is God rejecting us? They're also looking for scapegoats a bit. Don't you do that a bit when something goes wrong? Must be someone's fault. That's what happens, isn't it? It's just natural. So there's a lot of tension here, a lot of stress. And so what happens? The Jews flee to the surrounding countryside, up and around and away. At that time, that's okay. They're allowed to be around there. In another sort of 50 years, the Romans say, that's it. And they kick every Jew out of what they now call Palestine. Had other names, but now it's just Palestine because not giving it Jewish names, not letting them have a name of it. And they said, never again is a Jew to stand in Palestine. Which is interesting, isn't it, given our current situation. Quite fascinating, all that happens in the world. But this is the start of it. And what a mess that's brought us, what the Romans did here. Why did they do it? Anyone know why they did that? Because they're mean, yes, because they're mean and they're nasty. Why do you think that's what? John's speaking a bit deeply here, and I'll explain. The Jews had uprisen against the Greeks earlier and been able to overthrow them, sort of, and get freedom for themselves. And they thought, we'll do the same for the Romans. And so they kept fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. Every other nation, when the Romans took them over, eventually they just said, we'll be Roman because we get all these good things. But the Jews didn't say that. No, we're going to fight, we're going to fight, we're going to fight. And eventually Rome said, that's enough. Had enough. It's too much. You know? Yeah, they were mean. That's right. Well, I think they were angry. And it destroyed their order of the world and how the world should be under Roman rule. So the Jews flee to the surrounding countryside. And the worship centre changes. Originally, it was the temple, wasn't it? And they had these things called the synagogues, which were good. They were local things that you could go along to, and you could listen to the Torah, it's called, or the law, you know, the Old Testament, you'd listen to law and the prophets. And that was a great thing. But actually, the worship was centered on the temple. But the temple's gone, isn't it? It's smashed to the ground. And so the synagogue becomes the only place left. And the guys who run the synagogue, they're the only ones left in power. These are guys called Pharisees and scribes. You'll hear about them a bit. So they're left in power, the only leadership group left, which is interesting. So the other ones, there's a group called the Sadducees, a group called the Essenes, and basically they disappear. The Sadducees, who were the priests and all that lot, they didn't have a job anymore. And so the Pharisees and scribes, and what we have now in Judaism now is from the Pharisees and the scribes. It's that thing handed down. The rest of it disappeared, and that's what we have now. All right, why am I saying all this stuff? See, there was a problem here, though. In about AD 85, we don't know exactly when, there was an edict that goes out to expel the Nazarene sect from the synagogue. Christians. Expel, get rid of all the Christians out of the synagogue. They think it's about AD 85. There's lots of arguments about when it was, but it's certainly somewhere in that period. It was from, well, the leaders of the Jewish nation that had arisen up after that. Yes. And certainly the Pharisees and the scribes and the ones running all the synagogues. Now, there's a lot of arguments about how long it took for this to happen, but actually they think it took a while for it to be implemented fully. But if you think about that, that means before that time, all the Christian Jews were still going to synagogue. And why wouldn't you? I know for me, one of the problems I had thinking about this stuff is I had this head that they became Christian and they went to church. No, they didn't actually. They became Christian, and yes, they would meet together with other Christians, but they'd also go to synagogue because they were still Jews. Still very much Jewish. And this was who they were, and in their mind, they are just continuing to be Jews with a Messiah. So they were. That's an important idea, isn't it? But there's trouble happening, isn't there? So it's good to look at why the edict went out. What was happening that made the Jewish leaders kick the Christians out? An important thing, isn't it? All right, so let's have a look at that. What are the Jewish problems with the Christians? There's a few of them. I've picked three. There's many, but these are three that I think are good for us. They mixed with non-Jews. That's not good, is it? They're mixing with non-Jewish people. And that caused tension. Can I say, you see that in the church anyway. Tension with Paul and Peter about that. The mixing with non-Jews. So it had tension in the church. How do you think it happened between Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians? Jewish Christians and non-Christian Jews. Yeah, I had to get that right, didn't I? I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about that online. So between Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews, that's way more tension. You guys, you're mixing with the wrong crowd, with people that aren't Jewish. You're doing everything wrong, you know. So they did that. They also kept on insisting that this Jesus was the Messiah. That would get you quite annoyed, wouldn't it? I'd be annoyed if I was a Jew doing that. And this person keeps on banging on about Jesus fulfilling all these things and being the Messiah. It's like, oh, shut up, So it caused tension. And we know that if you read the book of Acts and some of the things around, it was more than tension. It was quite strong persecution. They killed Christians. So there was a bit of that happening as well. It didn't happen everywhere, but it did happen a bit. They also didn't follow the law. I've said the same way. I'm being nice about this. In fact, the issue was that the non-Christian Jews thought the Christian Jews weren't following the law at all, were breaking the law. You know that they said this about Jesus, didn't they? They said that Jesus is a lawbreaker. They said he doesn't keep the Sabbath. He lets his disciples eat when they're not meant to eat. There's all this stuff. He's just a lawbreaker. It's one of the things that they sort of yell at him. What's that? He heals on the Sabbath, all these things. He keeps breaking the law according to their understanding of the law, doesn't he? So the leader that the Christians have, he's bad, according to the Jews. And then you had this guy Paul running around. And Paul was worse. He seems to totally reject the law. And if you read Acts 21, I'll let you do it yourself. You can read the book Acts 21. In it, you see the Jews, and they're accusing Paul, and they're saying, he gets people all over the world, he's teaching people not to follow the law. That's what they say. Now, if you read Paul, that's not what he says. But that's what they accused him of. Now, I'll give those as two examples. So obviously there's a lot of tension there about who's really following the law. Who's doing it right. Into this situation, Matthew writes. So he's writing to a group of Christians who have always been Jewish and still want to remain Jewish because Jesus is the fulfillment of being Jewish. He's the Messiah that was to come and is risen from the dead into new life, and this is what the promise was for the Jews and for everyone. But their own people are rejecting them, saying no, and having arguments with them, and eventually kicking them out of the synagogue, kicking them out of Jewish life. So there's a good reason to write some stuff, isn't there? Say, hang on, what did Jesus do? What was he like? What did he say? Mark's got some stuff, but Matthew goes, I remember more. There's more stuff to have. More. So let's have a look at what he says. That's important. So we come to our greatest sermon that Matthew writes down. Now I'm going to be cruel and I'm not going to start with the sermon. I'm going to look at background again, aren't I? Oh, the scene. Where does he give it? Where does he give this sermon? On the Mount, that's right, it's a sermon on the Mount. And this is where we get that from. Seeing the crowd, he went up onto the mountain and sitting, it's interesting because he sat, you'd sit to teach. Now, interesting, his disciples came to him, opening his mouth. He taught them, saying, that's just a Greek way of saying things. Now, was it just the disciples he talked to? Seems to say that there, but actually later on, and I'm telling you this because later on it says the crowd were amazed. So no, the crowd were there too. So he sits down, the disciples go, oh, quick sit, and he starts teaching and everyone goes, oh, come in, let's listen to him. Because the crowd are there to hear him. That's what they're there for. Massive crowd comes and he sits. You don't sort of think of it as sitting. Here I am preaching to you and I'm standing. But actually, in Jesus' day, you sat to teach. You sat to speak. There was times you'd stand, and that would be to interact and converse strongly and all that sort of thing, but actually you sat to teach. So he sat. Why do you think for Matthew it's important that he was on a mountain? It was a little bit of that. Luke, we'll get back to that in a sec. Luke says that he was on a plane. Now, no, not an aeroplane, a plane Although the word in Luke's, in Greek, could mean a flat bit on a mountain, a mesa, or it could have been that. But also, we don't know if it's the same sermon because it's actually very different in Luke. And likely, in my thinking, Jesus moved around all the time, so he got to preach the same stuff over and over again. One of the hardest things about being a pastor in a church that you speak to the same people every week is you have to bring new stuff every week, don't you? You know, I know some people that preach, but they just go around and preach, and they preach their one amazing sermon that they've worked on for 20 years, and that's their sermon. And everyone goes, oh, they speak so well. Yeah, it's easy. They only have that one thing to say, don't they? No, I'm being cruel. No, it's not true. It's not easy. But there's a difference. And Jesus was that. He did say lots of different things, but he probably said the same stuff over and over again. So who knows? We don't know really why there's a difference. And Luke's is much shorter and doesn't have certain bits in it and has other bits. So who knows? But I think John was right. What you said, John. Moses. This is from Exodus 19. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai, on top of the mountain, and the Lord summoned Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up. Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. So here's Moses coming down the mountain. The people are on the side of the mountain, and he speaks to them. Very much he's trying to invoke that thing of Moses again. Because the truth is, he could have just said, he spoke to the crowd, couldn't he? He didn't have to bring the mountain in, but he did. Because, does anyone know, what did Moses speak in Exodus 19? It's 19 and 20. What was the thing he brought? The Ten Commandments, the law. That's exactly it. And here is the new law, or the law properly. What it is. And we'll see that as we go on a little bit. It'll be a few weeks away that we really delve into that. That's okay. So here we have Jesus coming down to say to Jews what God is really wanting, isn't it? So how does he start? I love his start. Blessed are, doesn't he? What he says. Starts and said, blessed are poor in spirit. Very good, poor in spirit. Now, I've got lots to say about this, but I'm going to say it next week. I'm only going to say a little bit about it this week because I wanted to build this. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Sort of seems the wrong way round, doesn't it? And that's the whole point. It is the wrong way round. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. It's up there, I know, beside. You can see it because I've got that other pretty looking one, the meek. I struggle to read this without thinking of Monty Python. It's not good, I know, but I love their take on it, the fact that the people at the back can't hear it properly, and someone says, the Greek, did anybody catch his name? Who apparently is going to inherit the earth. Very clever, because just think about it. In a crowd that big, Jesus is sitting to speak. The people at the back, how did they hear? I don't know. Blessed are the meek, blessed are hunger and thirst for righteousness. At the moment, other Jewish people are saying, yeah, that's right, we like that. But the other three are a bit off, aren't they? Blessed are the merciful. You're reading very well, dear. Well done. That's good. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure of heart, clean of heart. It's a good one, isn't it? Blessed are the peacemakers. Not the cheesemakers, the peacemakers. That's an interesting one, given you think of the situation at the time. The Romans had just smashed the Jews, hadn't they? Blessed are the peacemakers? Really? Surely blessed are the ones who stand up against the Romans and overthrow them. Jesus says, and Matthew reminds people, Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. Stunning. These are a great list, aren't they? Quite an amazing list of things that sort of turn everything round as to what they're thinking. But I've missed one out, haven't I? I've missed one. Have I? I'm trying to remember what it was. You can read it up there. It's sitting there. Yeah. All right. Let's look at the one I've missed out, because that's actually what I want to get to today. Blessed are those who are persecuted on account of righteousness, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. When you read that, actually, think the first thing he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So it's exactly the same. They get the same thing, the same blessing, don't they? Now, this was a way in ancient things of closing off an idea, going, and they get the same. Yes, they're all the one group of people, really. That's what he's saying, isn't it? Blessed are they who are persecuted on account of righteousness. But what I find interesting about this is the only one that Jesus expands on. It's only one that gets a bigger gig later in the next verse. Because he goes on to say this: blessed are you when they insult you, persecute you, and say all evil about you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and have exceeding joy, for your reward is great in heaven, for in this way they persecuted the prophets before you. That's interesting, isn't it? Blessed are you when they insult you. What's happening to these people right now? The audience of Matthew. It's exactly happening. Exactly. This group of people, the leaders of their nation, are insulting them. Other non-Christian Jews are insulting them. They say all evil about them falsely on account of Jesus, don't they? Saying all these wrong things about them. We saw them earlier. They did say some wrong things about them, didn't they? On account of Jesus. They're persecuted, aren't they? It's a good thing to say, isn't it? This is why Matthew puts more effort and goes, Jesus went on about this. Likely he probably went on about all of them, because if you read Matthew 5 to 7, if you read it out in a straight line, it takes about 5 minutes. Guarantee it wasn't the whole sermon. Because there's no way all these people would have walked up the hill to listen to a guy for 5 minutes. It's not how it works, is it? These were things that Jesus said, but obviously there was more meat. Matthew puts this bit of meat in. Blessed are you when they insult you, persecute you, say all evil about you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and have exceeding joy. Now, I actually struggled to translate this when I was translating it, because it does say rejoice, one of the ways of saying rejoice. And then the next bit it says, and have exceeding rejoice, is all it says. The next word that he does is actually basically saying to do the same thing, but just abundantly, more. Rejoice and have exceeding joy. Is that how you feel when you're persecuted? Is that what you think you should do? This is a tough thing, isn't it? Jesus is saying that Matthew's writing down for these people. Rejoice and have exceeding joy, for your reward is great in heaven. For in this way, they persecuted the prophets before you. Who's the they? Sorry, say it a bit louder. The Jewish authorities. That's exactly right. You're getting harassed by the Jewish authorities right now. What happened centuries ago? Jesus brings this up because he's talking to a Jewish crowd there. Matthew writes it down because this is really important. They persecuted all the prophets. And you read in the Old Testament constantly the Jewish authorities, the kings, the others ruling, persecuted the prophets because they didn't like what they were saying. Jesus said they did this before. They persecuted the prophets before you, so you're on the prophet's side. You're on the right side, aren't you? Your side is the good side. That's important. For great is your reward in heaven. See, when I look back at what he's just said to them, a whole lot of it with these eyes, it's interesting. Matthew's audience says this: They're being rejected by their own kind, aren't they? They're ostracized from Jewish worship life. They're spoken ill against. Everything they've grown up with is being taken away from them. Everything. That's a hard thing, isn't it? Some of them, and they're getting beaten. Some are getting killed. It's an intense time. And he says, rejoice and have exceeding joy. Though you mourn, because they would have been mourning. Though you are poor in spirit, because they're the ones being bullied. They're the ones being downtrodden, aren't they? He says, remain meek. Continue to hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's a hard thing to do, isn't it, when all this is going on around you? Remain meek. Continue to hunger and thirst for righteousness, because that's the blessed things. Stay pure of heart. That's a hard thing to do. One of my favourite verses is when, where I was, I think it's Hebrews, says, do not let a root of bitterness grow up in you. Keep your heart clean, pure. That's really hard when you're being persecuted, when you're being oppressed, when you're constantly being harassed. That's when that's hard. You've got to keep your heart pure. Keep it clean. Be merciful. Are people being merciful to you? No. That doesn't matter, does it? Be merciful. Make peace. For great is your reward. This is a great thing to say, isn't it? To start a sermon. It's not easy. But it's what was expected of the Christians. It's what's expected of us. How about you when you have people against you? How do you react? In your workplace, in your homes, in all these places, how do you react? I can't say I'm brilliant at this. But I know this is what God calls me to. I know this is the way I should be. Because this is where life is, where Jesus is. And my reward is great there. Today the challenge is simple. Have you allowed the life of Jesus, the way Jesus lives, to infuse your life so that you can, while you mourn and are poor in spirit, remain meek, continue to hunger and thirst for righteousness, to stay pure of heart, be merciful, and make peace. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, you challenge us to really difficult things. But we know that you have done them. And even more so, we know that your Spirit lives within us. And your power is within us that we can do these things. That we remain with you. We live with you and we become like you. Lord, we pray. Dwell in us with power richly. That we may be merciful. We may remain meek. Lord, that we'll stay pure of heart. That we'll be peacemakers. That we would hunger and thirst for righteousness that is merciful and just. That we would be like you. Lord, bless us in this, we pray. Amen. I hope you enjoy what I've been getting out of this. I said I've been studying this for a little while now. It's my particular thing I have to study at the moment. And I'm just loving what God is showing me. And I want to share with you, but because it's this sermon, nothing's easy. The reality is what I want for this place and what we want for this place is this to be a place where God is known. And actually, the first place he's known is in us. So that's why this sermon's important, isn't it? Excellent. Amen. Well, we've got just a few notices to give before we head off. First one is simply that through this month and next month we'll be continuing our World's Greatest Sermon tribute. And so it's starting October, already in October, so it started, hasn't it? The Sermon on the Mount. And hopefully we glean a bit more as we go through it and you gain more. It's good for you. And this is coming up at the end of October, October 27th, so the last weekend of October here. We've got a guest speaker and musician. His name is Benny Prasad. I'm quite excited. He comes from India. He goes all over the world. It says here he created the world's first bongo guitar. I'm going to show you in a second what it is. But even more so, he created another guitar. So he's got a bongo guitar, and he's holding that there in the picture. But he has another thing, the 54-stringed, what he called bentar, which also has a bongo in it. And I'm going to show you in a second because it's amazing. He's a Christian speaker with the world record, the fastest to travel to every country on earth. So as a speaker, he went around, he's been to every country and a whole lot of other bits too that are, like countries but not full countries. And he has the Guinness World Record as the fastest to do it. I don't know if he set out to do that. I don't think he did. But this is his book there. It's called Unthinkable, Suicidal to Breaking the World Record. And he talks about what God's done in him. It's quite good. And hopefully you'll have some of those books here you can do. So that will be on the 27th. Quite excited that he's coming. He's spoken, I've seen all over the place. Well, we're going to work that out. I think so. And now, do you want to see his bentar? All right. Here we go. The 54-string bentar. Have a look at that thing. So he's got a couple of bongo things in it. Wait till he uses a bit more. I've got the whole thing there, but I won't watch it all. Quite stunning, isn't it? So he created this himself. What I'm interested in, but he doesn't show it in this, is the guitar neck that's backward. I want to know about that. You impressed? I think it does have two sides on it. He must flip it over and play, and there's something different on the other side. How would you like playing that, Suzanne? You're a bit confused by it. Now, he does lead worship. His wife is a wonderful singer too. So it's quite exciting to have him come along. So I'll turn it off now, but oops, except it's not clicking past. Oh, there we go. Anyway, so it's really exciting that he's coming. So what I'll say, invite anyone. It's also on the same week that we're having our gather for dinner, and we're doing a barbecue that night out there. It's, of course, as you can see now, it's daylight savings. Don't you love it? The fact it's still light around. So it should be a great night. Invite all your friends. I have several friends I want to invite now already, particularly some musical friends. I'll say, come and watch this guy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I can do that? Yes, definitely. We'll send all the things. The guy who is bringing him out here, a guy named Kumar I've spoken to, and he's getting me some official stuff to send out, but I haven't got that yet. But we can still put some stuff up and start to get it out there. So I'm quite excited by that. It'll be a good night, I think. I'm excited that we'll probably have the seats all around because it's dinner night, but it should be a really good time. ticketed system, maybe. Yes, I'm not certain because I know that it will also be promoted by this guy who's promoting. So he's here to do a few things, but this is one of them. So very excited. Yeah, but so we may struggle with that as a thing. I recognise I thought of that too, but I thought this was an opportunity. It's an opportunity that came up. I thought, well, let's grab it and do it. So it should be good. Other than that, there's the banking details to all the give. Thank you to all those who continue to give. Of course, if you're giving cash, you can give it at the back there. Other than that, God bless you all. Have a great week. Enjoy tea and coffee for those here. And if you're at home watching, enjoy dinner and tea and coffee there. All right.